The morning of September 15th, 2001, dawned crisp and clear over Millbrook Park in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The kind of Saturday that seemed designed for family gatherings, with golden sunlight filtering through the maple trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of late summer grass. Sarah Chen was spreading a red-checkered tablecloth across the weathered picnic table when she first noticed how perfect everything felt. Too perfect, perhaps, though she wouldn't think of it that way until much later. Her children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Lucas, were already tugging at her sleeves, eager to explore the sprawling park that had been their family's traditional picnic spot for 3 generations. Emma, with her serious dark eyes and carefully braided hair, clutched a worn copy of Charlotte's Web against her chest, never going anywhere without a book. Lucas bounced on his toes, his untied sneakers threatening to trip him at any moment, his gap-toothed grin infectious as he pointed toward the playground equipment visible through the trees. "Can we go play now, Mom? Please?" Lucas's voice carried that particular urgency that only 6-year-olds could muster when faced with the prospect of swings and slides. Sarah's husband, David, was unloading the cooler from their blue Honda Civic, the same car they'd driven to this very spot dozens of times before. He looked up and smiled, that easy smile that had first caught Sarah's attention in their college library 15 years earlier. "Let them run around a bit," he called over. "The food can wait." The park stretched out before them like a living postcard of American suburbia. Millbrook Park covered nearly 40 acres of rolling hills, dotted with century-old oak trees and bisected by a meandering creek that sang softly over smooth stones. The playground sat at the park's heart, surrounded by dense clusters of native Iowa shrubs and wildflowers that the city council had planted as part of a beautification project in the late 1990s. Beyond that, walking trails wound through areas of carefully maintained natural wilderness, where families often discovered deer grazing in the early morning hours. If stories of families finding their way back to each other move you, you might want to subscribe, because sometimes the most ordinary moments hold the most extraordinary mysteries. Sarah watched her children race toward the playground, Emma's book tucked safely in her back pocket, Lucas's laughter trailing behind them like breadcrumbs. Other families had claimed spots throughout the park: the Hendersons with their 3 teenagers near the baseball diamond, the elderly Martinez couple feeding ducks by the pond, a young mother pushing a stroller along the paved path that circled the park's perimeter. It was the kind of scene that made Cedar Falls feel like the safest place on earth. The Chen family had been coming to Millbrook Park since Emma was barely walking. It was here that Lucas had taken his first tentative steps across the grass, here that Emma had learned to read by sounding out the words on the bronze plaques that marked various native plants. David often joked that their children knew every square inch of the park better than the groundskeepers did. Sarah's mother had brought her to this same park 30 years earlier, and her grandmother before that. There was something deeply rooting about the continuity, the way the same picnic tables had hosted 3 generations of Chen family birthdays, anniversaries, and lazy Saturday afternoons. The park felt like an extension of their home, a place where dangers seemed as distant as other planets. As Sarah unpacked the sandwiches she'd made that morning, peanut butter and jelly for Lucas, turkey and Swiss for Emma, who had recently declared herself too sophisticated for peanut butter, she could hear her children's voices mixing with those of other kids on the playground. Emma was probably organizing some elaborate game that involved rules only she fully understood, while Lucas was likely making friends with every child within a 10-foot radius. David settled beside her on the picnic bench, his hand finding hers with the automatic comfort of 15 years of marriage. "Remember when we thought this would be the hard part?" he asked, nodding toward where their children played, getting them to eat vegetables and go to bed on time. Sarah squeezed his hand, understanding what he meant. The world felt different now, after the events of just 4 days earlier. The images from New York and Washington had been playing on endless loop on every television in America, making parents everywhere hold their children a little tighter, look over their shoulders a little more often. But here, in the dappled sunshine of Millbrook Park, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of small-town Saturday life, it was almost possible to believe that such darkness couldn't touch places like Cedar Falls. "They're safe here," Sarah said, more to herself than to David. This is the safest place in the world for them. The playground equipment was the kind that had been installed in the early 1990s, designed with safety in mind, but still allowing for the kind of adventurous play that built character and scraped knees in equal measure. Emma and Lucas had claimed the tallest slide as their kingdom, taking turns being the ruler and the loyal subject in games that seemed to shift rules and objectives every few minutes. Sarah checked her watch. 11:47 a.m. In her memory, this moment would become frozen like a photograph, the exact minute when everything was still perfect, still whole, still safe. The moment before the world shifted on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. She called out to the children, her voice carrying easily across the autumn air. 5 more minutes, then lunch." Emma waved back, her serious little face breaking into a rare smile. Lucas had already moved on to the monkey bars, his small hands gripping the metal rungs, with the fierce determination that characterized everything he did. David was arranging the food on the table, creating the kind of organized spread that would make their children feel like this was a feast rather than just sandwiches and chips. He had a gift for making ordinary moments feel special, a quality that Sarah had fallen in love with, and that she hoped their children would remember long after they'd grown up and moved away to have Saturday picnics with families of their own. The minutes ticked by with the gentle rhythm of a perfectly ordinary Saturday afternoon. Other families packed up their belongings and headed home. The elderly couple by the pond finished feeding the ducks and began their slow walk back to the parking area. The autumn light shifted subtly, painting everything in slightly deeper shades of gold and amber. At exactly 11:52 a.m., Sarah called to her children again. "Emma, Lucas, lunchtime." Her voice echoed off the trees and seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. She waited for the familiar sound of their footsteps running across the grass, for Emma's voice explaining why they needed just 2 more minutes, for Lucas's giggles as he tried to negotiate for extra playground time. Instead, there was only silence. The kind of silence that makes a mother's heart skip a beat, even when logic says there are a dozen innocent explanations. Sarah stood up from the picnic table, shading her eyes against the sun as she scanned the playground equipment. Empty swings moved slightly in the breeze. The slide gleamed silver and vacant in the afternoon light. "Emma? Lucas?" Her voice carried a note of concern now, though she told herself it was nothing. They were probably hiding, or had wandered over to look at the ducks, or were using the restroom facilities near the park entrance. Children didn't just vanish into thin air, especially not in places like Millbrook Park on perfect Saturday afternoons in September. But as Sarah walked toward the playground, calling their names with increasing urgency, she began to understand that some kinds of disappearances don't announce themselves with drama or obvious danger signs. Sometimes, people simply step from one moment into another, leaving behind only silence and the terrible knowledge that the world is far less safe than anyone wants to believe. The red-checkered tablecloth fluttered in the breeze, still spread with a lunch that would never be eaten, still waiting for 2 children who would not come running across the grass when their mother called their names. David's reaction was immediate and methodical, the kind of response that comes from a mind refusing to accept what it's beginning to understand. While Sarah stood frozen by the empty playground, calling their children's names with a voice that grew more strained with each repetition, David was already moving through the park with the systematic precision of someone conducting a search pattern he'd never imagined he'd need to know. He checked the restrooms first, both the men's and women's facilities, calling out as he pushed open doors, his voice echoing off tiled walls. Empty. He jogged to the duck pond, thinking perhaps the children had been drawn by the mallards that often gathered near the wooden bridge. The elderly Martinez couple was gone now, and the water reflected only clouds and overhanging branches. No small figures crouched at the water's edge, no voices discussing whether ducks could understand human conversation, which had been Lucas's theory during their last visit. The playground equipment revealed nothing. No forgotten book tucked behind the slide, no sneaker left behind in the sand beneath the swings. Emma's copy of Charlotte's Web was nowhere to be found, which struck David as particularly wrong. Emma never went anywhere without a book, treating them like other children treated security blankets. The absence of that familiar paperback felt like a clue, though he couldn't understand what it might mean. Sarah had moved beyond calling their names to asking other families if they'd seen two children matching Emma and Lucas's descriptions. A mother with twin toddlers shook her head sympathetically. "I saw them playing on the big slide about 20 minutes ago," she offered. "The little boy was trying to convince his sister to race him down, but I haven't seen them since." 20 minutes. David felt something cold settle in his stomach as he processed this timeline. 20 minutes in which his children had simply ceased to exist in the observable world. By 12:15 p.m., they had searched every visible inch of Millbrook Park. David had even ventured into the wooded areas beyond the main playground, following the narrow trails that wound between oak and maple trees toward the park's more remote corners. His voice was growing hoarse from calling their names. Sarah had begun to cry, though she was trying to hide it, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand between conversations with other park visitors. "We need to call the police," David said, the words feeling surreal as they left his mouth. Police were for other people's emergencies, for situations you read about in newspapers or saw on television news, not for Saturday afternoon picnics at the park where your mother had pushed you on swings 30 years earlier. The 911 call was made at 12:23 p.m. from David's Nokia cell phone, the same phone on which he'd called Sarah that morning to confirm they were still planning the picnic. The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm, asking for descriptions, last known locations, what the children had been wearing. Emma, dark hair in braids, pink sweater, jeans, white sneakers, carrying a book. Lucas, brown hair, red t-shirt with a dinosaur on the front, denim shorts, sneakers that lit up when he walked. Cedar Falls Police Department responded with the kind of speed that small cities can manage when children are involved. Officer Jennifer Walsh arrived first, her patrol car pulling into the Millbrook Park parking lot at 12:31 p.m. She was young, perhaps early 30s, with the kind of efficient demeanor that suggested she'd handled missing child cases before and understood the protocols. "How long since you last saw them?" she asked, pulling out a notebook that looked well worn from use. "About 40 minutes, Sarah replied, her voice steadier now that official help had arrived. "We were having a picnic. They were playing on the playground. I called them for lunch and they just weren't there anymore." Officer Walsh began the process that would become familiar over the coming hours and days, systematic questions about the children's habits, their likelihood to wander off, any recent changes in behavior or family circumstances that might explain an unusual departure. She took detailed descriptions and radioed for additional units to assist with the search. Within an hour, Millbrook Park had been transformed from a peaceful family gathering place into the center of an active police investigation. Officers walked the perimeter, checking fence lines and drainage ditches. A K-9 unit arrived, the German Shepherd immediately putting his nose to the ground near the playground equipment where Emma and Lucas had last been seen. The dog's behavior was puzzling. He picked up a scent trail that led from the playground toward the wooded area at the park's eastern edge, but the trail seemed to dissipate near a cluster of dense shrubs and native prairie grass that the Park Service had planted as part of their natural habitat restoration project. The handler, Officer Mike Rodriguez, had worked with dogs for 15 years and trusted his partner's instincts implicitly. "They definitely went this direction," Rodriguez told the gathering crowd of officers and volunteers. "But then, it's like the trail just stops. Duke's never wrong about this kind of thing, but he's acting confused." The search expanded beyond the park boundaries. Officers canvassed the residential neighborhoods that surrounded Millbrook Park, knocking on doors and asking residents if they'd seen two children matching Emma and Lucas's descriptions. Several people remembered seeing the Chen family arrive that morning, but no one recalled seeing the children leave. Sarah found herself answering the same questions repeatedly. No, the children had never wandered off before. No, they weren't upset about anything. No, there were no family disputes or custody issues. No, they wouldn't have gone with strangers. Emma was naturally cautious, and both children had been thoroughly taught about stranger danger. Lucas might be friendly and outgoing, but he would never leave the park without permission, especially not without telling his parents where he was going. As the afternoon wore on, the search grew more organized and more desperate. Volunteers from the community began arriving, neighbors, members of their church, parents of Emma and Lucas's classmates. Someone had called the local television station, and by 4 p.m., news vans were parked along the street outside Millbrook Park. The Cedar Falls Fire Department brought specialized equipment, portable lights for when darkness fell, communication devices that could coordinate search efforts across a wider area. The County Sheriff's Department contributed additional personnel and access to helicopter support if needed. David spent the remaining daylight hours walking the same trails repeatedly, as if his children might materialize through sheer force of will and parental determination. He found himself memorizing details he'd never noticed before. The way sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves overhead, the sound of the creek that ran along the park's northern boundary, the particular smell of autumn grass and dying flowers that would forever remind him of this day. Sarah remained near the picnic table, their untouched lunch still spread across the red-checkered tablecloth. She had become the unofficial coordinator for the growing group of volunteers, organizing search parties and maintaining lists of areas that had been covered. It was easier to focus on logistics than to let her mind wander to the question that was growing larger and more terrible with each passing hour. Where were Emma and Lucas, and what had happened to them? As sunset approached, the search took on a more urgent quality. Children who disappear during daylight hours and aren't found before dark face exponentially increased risks, a fact that everyone involved understood, but no one wanted to voice aloud. The last systematic search of the day covered the creek area, where officers waded through shallow water with flashlights, looking for any sign that the children might have wandered too close to the water's edge. They found nothing, no clothing, no books, no light-up sneakers stuck in the muddy bottom. At 8:47 p.m., as police floodlights illuminated Millbrook Park in harsh white light that made everything look like a crime scene, Detective Ray Morrison made the decision to suspend active searching until morning. The park had been covered multiple times by multiple teams. If Emma and Lucas Chen were still within the park's boundaries, they would have been found, which meant they weren't there anymore. And if they weren't there, then someone had taken them, or they had left on their own, or something had happened that didn't fit the normal patterns of children getting lost during family picnics. Sarah and David drove home that night to a house that felt impossibly empty. Emma's bedroom, with its carefully organized bookshelf and collection of stuffed animals arranged by size, waited for a little girl who might never come home to sleep in her own bed again. Lucas's room, cluttered with Lego constructions and dinosaur figurines, seemed frozen in time, waiting for hands that might never again build castles or create elaborate prehistoric battle scenes. The house filled with family members and close friends, people who brought casseroles and offered comfort and asked if there was anything they could do to help. But there was nothing anyone could do except wait and hope, and try not to think about all the reasons why two children might vanish without a trace on a perfect Saturday afternoon in the safest place their parents knew. Detective Ray Morrison had been investigating missing persons cases for 12 years, long enough to recognize the patterns that usually emerged within the first 48 hours. Children who wandered off were typically found within a few miles of where they'd disappeared, often scared and hungry, but fundamentally unharmed. Children who'd been taken by non-custodial family members left digital trails, credit card purchases, phone calls, witnesses who'd seen familiar faces in unexpected places. The Chen case fit none of these patterns. By Monday morning, the FBI had been called in, standard procedure for cases involving multiple missing children where abduction was suspected. Special Agent Linda Cruz arrived from the Des Moines field office with a team of specialists and a methodical approach to investigation that both comforted and terrified Sarah and David. The FBI's involvement meant resources and expertise, but it also meant their children's disappearance was being treated as a federal crime. Agent Cruz was a woman in her mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd delivered difficult news to too many families. She established a command center in the Cedar Falls Police Department and began the process of expanding the investigation beyond the physical search of Millbrook Park. "We're looking at this from multiple angles," she explained to Sarah and David during their first formal interview. Stranger abduction, though statistically unlikely, remains a possibility. We're also investigating whether Emma and Lucas might have encountered someone they knew, a family friend, acquaintance, someone who might have convinced them to leave the park voluntarily. The interview process was exhaustive and emotionally devastating. Sarah found herself recounting not just the events of Saturday afternoon, but details about their family life that felt intensely private. Their marriage, their parenting style, their children's personalities and relationships with teachers, neighbors, extended family members. Every person who'd had contact with Emma and Lucas became a potential suspect or witness. David's brother Tom, who lived in Minneapolis and hadn't seen the children in 6 months, was interviewed by phone. Sarah's mother, who babysat regularly and had been planning to visit the following weekend, provided a detailed account of her last conversations with her grandchildren. Even Emma's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was asked about any unusual behavior or concerning interactions she might have observed. The physical investigation expanded as well. Crime scene technicians processed areas of Millbrook Park with the kind of scientific precision usually reserved for violent crimes. They collected soil samples from the area where the K9 unit had lost the scent trail, took photographs of every inch of the playground equipment, and dusted surfaces for fingerprints that might belong to someone other than the hundreds of families who used the park regularly. Local television coverage had evolved from brief news segments to ongoing coverage that attracted attention far beyond Cedar Falls. By Tuesday, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. CNN ran a segment titled, "Vanished Two Children Disappear from Iowa Park." The Today Show featured interviews with Detective Morrison and Agent Cruz, both carefully avoiding speculation while appealing for anyone with information to contact authorities. The media attention brought both hope and additional challenges. Tips began pouring in from across the Midwest, reported sightings of two children matching Emma, and Lucas's descriptions in gas stations, restaurants, highway rest stops from Nebraska to Minnesota. Each tip required investigation. Each potential sighting demanded follow-up that stretched already thin resources. Most of the reports proved false, cases of well-meaning witnesses whose memories had been influenced by the constant television coverage. A convenience store clerk in Ames was certain she'd seen the Chen children buying candy on Sunday afternoon, until security footage revealed the children in question were several years older and accompanied by their obviously related parents. A truck driver reported seeing two children who matched the descriptions at a highway rest stop near the Minnesota border, but subsequent investigation revealed he'd confused the date and was actually remembering an encounter from the previous week. But some tips seemed more promising. A woman walking her dog in a residential neighborhood adjacent to Millbrook Park reported seeing a dark-colored van parked along the street on Saturday morning, unusual because the area typically had very little traffic. She couldn't remember the license plate or make of the vehicle, but was certain it had been there when she began her walk and gone when she returned an hour later. Another witness, a teenager who'd been skateboarding through the park on Saturday afternoon, told police he'd noticed a man sitting alone on a bench near the playground area watching children play. The description was frustratingly vague: middle-aged, average height, wearing a baseball cap and dark clothing, but the teenager was certain the man had been there for at least 30 minutes, which was unusual behavior for someone without children of their own. FBI analysts created a timeline of Emma and Lucas's last known activities, mapping their movements through the park with the precision of a military operation. Security cameras from businesses near the park were collected and analyzed. Cell phone records from everyone who'd been in the area were requested and reviewed for unusual patterns or communications. The investigation revealed troubling gaps in what should have been a thoroughly documented public space. Millbrook Park, despite its popularity and city funding, had no security cameras. The playground area was not visible from any of the businesses along the adjacent streets. The wooded sections of the park, where the K9 trail had mysteriously ended, were dense enough to provide complete privacy for whatever might have occurred there. Sarah threw herself into the investigation with the desperate energy of a mother who believed that finding the right clue, asking the right question, or thinking of the right possibility might bring her children home. She created detailed maps of the park, marking every location where Emma and Lucas had played during previous visits. She compiled lists of everyone who might have known their family's routine of Saturday picnics, anyone who might have predicted they would be at Millbrook Park that specific afternoon. David's approach was different, but equally consuming. He spent hours driving the roads that led away from the park, stopping at every business, every farm, every house where two children might have been taken or might have sought help. He printed hundreds of flyers with Emma and Lucas's photographs and distributed them at truck stops, rest areas, and convenience stores throughout central Iowa. The flyers became a familiar sight throughout the region. Missing: Emma Chen, 8 years old, Lucas Chen, 6 years old. Last seen Millbrook Park, Cedar Falls, Iowa, September 15, 2001. Below the photographs, Emma's school picture showing her serious expression and carefully combed hair, Lucas's snapshot capturing his gap-toothed grin, was a phone number for the FBI tip line and a plea: "If you have any information, please call." As days turned into weeks, the massive search effort began to scale back. Volunteers returned to their normal routines. Media attention shifted to other stories. The FBI command center in Cedar Falls was reduced to a single agent who maintained contact with local law enforcement and continued following up on tips that still trickled in with decreasing frequency. But for Sarah and David, the investigation never scaled back. It became the organizing principle of their lives, the lens through which they viewed every interaction, every piece of information, every possibility that might explain what had happened to their children. They attended support group meetings for families of missing children, where they learned about cases that had been solved after months or years, and others that remained mysteries decades later. The hardest part was the gradual acknowledgement that their children might never be found, that the investigation might continue indefinitely without resolution. Police departments across the Midwest kept Emma and Lucas's photographs and descriptions in their active files. Their DNA profiles were entered into national databases. Their dental records were distributed to coroners and medical examiners throughout the region. But as autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, the daily reality of their absence became harder to deny. Emma would miss her 9th birthday in December. Lucas would not start first grade the following fall. The red checkered tablecloth, carefully washed and folded, remained in a closet drawer waiting for a family picnic that might never happen again. The investigation officially remained open, which meant it remained active in FBI databases and law enforcement networks. But unofficially, it had become one of those cases that detectives thought about late at night, wondering if they'd missed something crucial, if there had been a moment when asking a different question or following a different lead might have brought 2 children home to parents who never stopped looking for them. The first year after Emma and Lucas disappeared moved with the strange, suspended quality of life lived underwater. Sarah returned to her job as a high school English teacher in January 2002, not because she felt ready, but because the routine of lesson plans and parent conferences provided a framework that kept her from dissolving entirely. Her students, with the particular sensitivity that teenagers sometimes show in the face of adult tragedy, were unusually well behaved that spring semester, as if they understood that their teacher was held together by the thinnest of threads. David's response was different. He took extended leave from his position as a civil engineer with the county, spending his days maintaining what had become an exhaustive private investigation. Their dining room table disappeared under layers of maps, photographs, timelines, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies across 5 states. He drove thousands of miles that first year, following tips that had been deemed too remote for official investigation, checking abandoned buildings and remote areas where 2 children might have been taken. The house itself became a shrine to interrupted childhood. Emma's room remained exactly as she'd left it, her bed made with the precision she'd inherited from her mother, her bookshelf organized by author and then by publication date. Lucas's room retained its cheerful chaos, Lego constructions half-finished on the floor, dinosaur figurines arranged in elaborate battle scenes that would never be completed. Well-meaning friends and family members occasionally suggested that it might be healthy to pack away some of the children's belongings to create space for healing and moving forward. But Sarah couldn't bear the thought of disturbing anything that Emma and Lucas had touched. What if they came home and found their rooms changed? What if the arrangement of stuffed animals on Emma's bed or the specific placement of Lucas's toy cars contained some significance that only they would understand? The second year brought a different kind of pain, the recognition that the world was moving forward while their family remained frozen in September 2001. Other families at Millbrook Park resumed their weekend picnics. Emma's 3rd grade class, which had spent months learning about stranger safety and writing get-well cards that had no address to be sent to, gradually stopped mentioning their missing classmate. Lucas's kindergarten friends, with the adaptability of 6-year-olds, made new best friends and forgot the boy who had promised to teach them how to build the tallest Lego tower in the world. Sarah found herself caught between competing needs, the desire to keep Emma and Lucas's memory alive and present, and the psychological necessity of building some kind of life that wasn't entirely defined by their absence. She began volunteering with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, helping other families navigate the maze of law enforcement, media attention, and false hope that characterized the first months of a child's disappearance. David's obsession with finding answers gradually shifted from active searching to meticulous documentation. He created databases of similar cases, tracking patterns that might reveal information about what had happened to their children. He corresponded with other parents whose children had vanished under mysterious circumstances, comparing details and theories with the desperate precision of amateur detectives who had been abandoned by professional investigators. The marriage bore the strain that every counselor and support group had warned them about. Grief, they learned, was not a shared experience but a parallel one, two people living through the same loss in completely different ways, often unable to comfort each other because their coping mechanisms were incompatible. Sarah needed routine and gradual acceptance of uncertainty. David needed action, and the belief that the right combination of effort and persistence would eventually yield answers. They attended couples counseling sporadically, sessions that often devolved into arguments about how to remember Emma and Lucas, how much energy to devote to searching versus healing, whether hope was a necessary survival mechanism or a form of torture that prevented them from rebuilding their lives. The counselor, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez who specialized in family trauma, helped them understand that there was no correct way to survive the loss of children who might not actually be lost. Christmas of 2002 was particularly devastating. Sarah had insisted on buying presents for Emma and Lucas, books for Emma, dinosaur-themed toys for Lucas, wrapping them carefully and placing them under the tree, as if maintaining the ritual might somehow call their children home. David found this practice unbearable, but he lacked the heart to ask his wife to stop. The presents remained unopened until January, when Sarah finally moved them to the children's rooms, adding them to collections that grew each year on birthdays and holidays. The third anniversary of the disappearance brought unexpected media attention. A documentary filmmaker who specialized in unsolved missing persons cases contacted them about including Emma and Lucas's story in a program about children who had vanished from public places. The attention was painful but potentially valuable. Renewed coverage might reach someone who had information they hadn't shared before. The documentary, which aired on the Discovery Channel in November 2004, was respectfully done and factually accurate. It featured interviews with Detective Morrison and Agent Cruz, both of whom had moved on to other cases, but maintained that the Chen investigation remained active. The program included age-progressed photographs showing what Emma and Lucas might look like as an 11- and 9-year-old, images that were both hopeful and heartbreaking. The documentary generated dozens of new tips, most of which proved false, but some of which required serious investigation. A woman in Oregon contacted authorities to report that she'd seen children matching the age-progressed photographs at a shopping mall, but surveillance footage revealed the children she'd observed were clearly with their biological parents. A man in Colorado claimed to have information about a cult that kidnapped children for ritual purposes, but investigation revealed he was mentally ill and had made similar claims about multiple missing children cases. One tip seemed more substantial. A former Cedar Falls resident who had moved to California contacted the FBI to report that he'd seen a man with 2 children at a rest stop near Omaha on the evening of September 15, 2001. The children had seemed distressed, he said, and the man had been unusually aggressive when the witness tried to make friendly conversation. The witness had been traveling and hadn't heard about the disappearance until seeing the documentary 3 years later. FBI agents retraced the route between Cedar Falls and Omaha, interviewing gas station attendants and convenience store clerks who might have worked that evening. They examined security footage from the time period, though most had been recycled or destroyed in the intervening years. The investigation ultimately proved inconclusive, but it provided Sarah and David with something they'd been lacking: a plausible theory about what might have happened to their children. Perhaps Emma and Lucas had been taken by someone passing through the area, someone who had seen them playing at the park, and made an impulsive, terrible decision. Perhaps they were somewhere in the western United States, living under different names, their memories of their previous life growing dimmer with each passing year. It was a horrific possibility, but it was also a hopeful one. It meant their children might still be alive. By 2005, 4 years after the disappearance, Sarah and David had learned to live with ambiguity in ways they'd never imagined possible. They attended Emma's would-be middle school graduation, standing in the back of the auditorium and wondering if their daughter would have been valedictorian, or if she would have developed the teenage rebelliousness that seemed to transform all serious 8-year-olds eventually. They celebrated Lucas's birthdays by donating toys to local children's charities, imagining the joy their son would have felt watching other children play with dinosaur figurines and building blocks. The investigation remained officially open, but the day-to-day reality was that no one was actively working on the case unless new information emerged. Detective Morrison had retired. Agent Cruz had been transferred to the Chicago field office. The current investigators were professional and sympathetic, but Emma and Lucas Chen had become entries in a database rather than urgent priorities. Sarah and David developed new routines that acknowledged their loss while still allowing for the possibility of joy. They traveled, visiting places they'd always planned to explore as a family of 4, but now experienced as a couple, learning to be whole again. They maintained relationships with friends who had been patient enough to wait through years of cancelled plans and difficult anniversaries. They even, gradually and carefully, began to discuss the possibility that their lives might include happiness again. Though neither could imagine what form that happiness might take, the house began to change, almost imperceptibly. Emma's room remained a shrine, but Lucas's gradually became more of a guest room, as Sarah found herself unable to walk past his unchanged toys every day. David's investigation materials migrated from the dining room table to a home office where he could continue his research without it dominating their shared living space. They learned to recognize the anniversary reactions that came every September, the way Sarah would become withdrawn and irritable in the weeks leading up to the 15th, the way David would throw himself into reviewing case files and contacting law enforcement agencies that hadn't heard from him in months. They learned to be gentle with each other during these periods, understanding that grief had its own calendar and its own demands. Most surprisingly, they learned that it was possible to live fully while carrying an unsolved mystery. The question of what had happened to Emma and Lucas would never leave them, but it no longer defined every moment of every day. They could laugh at movies, enjoy dinners with friends, take pleasure in small accomplishments and seasonal changes. The guilt they felt about these moments of happiness gradually lessened, replaced by the understanding that Emma and Lucas would want their parents to experience joy wherever they were. But underneath the gradual healing, the question remained, patient and persistent as bedrock. What had happened to 2 children who had simply vanished from the safest place their parents knew? And would there ever be an answer that might bring them peace, if not reunion? By 2010, Emma would have been 17, a senior in high school preparing for college applications and senior prom. Lucas would have been 15, probably tall and gangly, his gap-toothed grin replaced by the serious expression that often accompanies adolescence. Sarah found herself scanning crowds of teenagers in shopping malls and school parking lots, searching for faces that might have grown from the children she remembered. wondering if she would even recognize her own son and daughter if she passed them on the street. The age progression photographs that the FBI updated every few years helped somewhat, though Sarah knew that computer-generated images could never capture the particular way Emma's nose crinkled when she was concentrating on a difficult book, or the specific shade of mischief that lit Lucas's eyes when he was planning some elaborate Lego construction project. The photographs showed attractive, generic teenagers who shared certain facial features with her missing children, but they felt like approximations of people who might never have existed. David had returned to work, gradually rebuilding a career that had been interrupted by 4 years of obsessive searching. His supervisors at the county engineering department had been remarkably patient, understanding that a man who had lost his children needed time to figure out how to continue living. His projects now focused on public safety infrastructure, improved lighting for parks and recreational areas, better sightlines for playgrounds, security camera installations for public spaces. It was as if he was trying to engineer a world where what had happened to Emma and Lucas couldn't happen to other families. The 10th anniversary of the disappearance brought renewed media attention, though more subdued than previous coverage. Local television stations ran brief segments marking the milestone, showing age-progressed photographs and reiterating the FBI tip line number. A reporter from the Cedar Falls Gazette wrote a thoughtful retrospective piece titled "A Decade of Questions," which focused not on the sensational aspects of the case but on how the Chen family and the broader community had been changed by the experience of living with unresolved loss. Sarah had become something of an advocate for missing children's families, serving on the board of a non-profit organization that provided support services for parents navigating the particular hell of not knowing what had happened to their children. She spoke occasionally at conferences, sharing what she'd learned about maintaining hope while accepting uncertainty, about building a life that honored missing children without being entirely consumed by their absence. "The hardest thing," she would tell other parents, "is learning to live in the present tense while part of your heart remains frozen in the past. You have to find a way to be fully alive for the life you're actually living, while staying open to the possibility that everything might change tomorrow." The Chen house had evolved over the decade into something that was part memorial, part family home, part museum of interrupted childhood. Emma's room had been gradually transformed into Sarah's study, lined with books about missing children and family trauma, though Emma's own bookshelf remained untouched, her favorite novels still waiting for their reader to return. Lucas's room had become a guest room, but his closet still contained carefully preserved clothing and toys, items that Sarah couldn't bring herself to donate, but also couldn't bear to look at every day. David's investigation had become more sophisticated and less frantic over the years. He maintained correspondence with law enforcement agencies, private investigators, and other families dealing with similar cases. His dining room office contained filing cabinets full of tips, theories, and possibilities, organized with the methodical precision of someone who believed that the right combination of information might eventually yield the answer he was seeking. He had developed particular expertise in cases involving children who disappeared from public places, and occasionally consulted with other families or law enforcement agencies dealing with similar situations. His analysis of patterns and commonalities had caught the attention of FBI behavioral analysts, who sometimes sought his input on cases that seemed to share characteristics with Emma and Lucas's disappearance. The marriage had survived, though it bore scars that would never fully heal. Sarah and David had learned to love each other around the shape of their loss, understanding that they were different people than they had been before September 15, 2001, but still recognizably themselves. They had developed new rituals and traditions that acknowledged their grief while still allowing for joy and connection. They traveled more than they had when the children were young, visiting places that Emma and Lucas would have enjoyed, and creating new memories that didn't require them to relive the particular happiness of family picnics and bedtime stories. They had season tickets to the local theatre company, attended wine tastings, took cooking classes together. They were building a life that was meaningful and fulfilling, though fundamentally different from the one they had planned. The case files maintained by the Cedar Falls Police Department and the FBI had grown thick over the years, filled with tips that had proven false, leads that had dissolved upon investigation, and theories that had seemed promising until they were tested against facts. Detective Morrison's replacement, Detective Sarah Kim, reviewed the case annually, looking for connections to new information or similar cases that might have emerged in other jurisdictions. Occasionally, there were developments that rekindled hope. In 2008, a child pornography investigation in Texas had uncovered photographs that might have shown Emma and Lucas, though image analysis ultimately proved inconclusive. In 2009, a woman in Montana contacted authorities claiming that she had been forced to care for 2 children who matched their descriptions, but her story contained contradictions that couldn't be resolved, and she was eventually found to be mentally ill. The most significant development had come in 2007, when construction workers renovating an old farmhouse about 50 miles from Cedar Falls discovered children's clothing buried in the basement. The items were the right size and approximate age to have belonged to Emma and Lucas, and DNA testing was ordered immediately. The results took 6 weeks to process, 6 weeks during which Sarah and David lived in a state of suspended animation, afraid to hope, but unable to prevent themselves from imagining that they might finally have answers. The DNA testing proved negative. The clothing had belonged to other children, probably from decades earlier, and the discovery had nothing to do with Emma and Lucas Chen. But those 6 weeks of waiting had reminded Sarah and David how much they still needed to know what had happened to their children, how the absence of resolution continued to shape their lives in fundamental ways. Millbrook Park had been renovated in 2006 with new playground equipment and improved security features that included surveillance cameras and better lighting. A small memorial garden had been planted near the spot where Emma and Lucas were last seen, with a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of all missing children and in hope of their safe return." Sarah and David attended the dedication ceremony, standing with other community members who had never forgotten the afternoon when 2 children had simply vanished from the safest place their parents knew. The park was busy again, filled with families who felt comfortable bringing their children to play on weekends and summer afternoons. The tragedy of 2001 had faded into local history, remembered by long-time residents, but not really part of the daily consciousness of newer families. Sarah found this both painful and reassuring. Painful because it meant Emma and Lucas were being forgotten by everyone except their parents, but reassuring because it meant other children could play there without their parents being consumed by fear. Technological advances had opened new possibilities for investigation. Social media platforms allowed for wider distribution of age-progressed photographs and information about the case. Database systems could cross-reference information from multiple jurisdictions more efficiently than had been possible in 2001. Cold case units in police departments across the country had access to more sophisticated analytical tools and communication networks. But technology also meant that if Emma and Lucas were alive somewhere, they might be living in a world where their disappearance was just a Google search away. Detective Kim occasionally wondered whether they might have tried to research their own case, whether somewhere there were teenagers who had discovered that they matched the descriptions of children who had disappeared from an Iowa park years earlier. The 15th anniversary in 2016 passed quietly, marked only by a brief newspaper article and Sarah's annual pilgrimage to Millbrook Park, where she sat on the bench nearest to where their picnic table had been and tried to remember exactly how Emma's laugh had sounded, how Lucas had looked when he was concentrating on building something with his Legos. The details were beginning to fade, despite her efforts to preserve them, and she realized that part of her children's disappearance was the gradual disappearance of her own memories of who they had been. David had begun talking about retirement, about the possibility of selling the house where Emma and Lucas had spent their early childhood, and moving somewhere without so many reminders of the life they had lost. Sarah wasn't ready for such a dramatic change, but she understood the appeal of starting over, in a place where no one knew their story, where they could be simply a couple in their 50s, rather than the parents whose children had vanished without explanation. But even as they planned for a future that didn't include the daily presence of their loss, neither Sarah nor David could imagine truly letting go of the question that had defined their lives for 15 years. Somewhere, somehow, there was an explanation for what had happened on September 15th, 2001. Somewhere there were answers that might bring them peace, if not reunion. They had learned to live without those answers, but they had never learned to stop wanting them. The emergence of consumer drone technology in the mid-2010s had initially seemed irrelevant to Sarah and David Chen's ongoing quest for answers about their missing children. Drones were toys for hobbyists, tools for photographers and real estate agents, gadgets that captured aerial footage for social media posts and travel videos. They had nothing to do with the systematic search for 2 children who had vanished from Millbrook Park 16 years earlier. But technology has a way of revealing possibilities that weren't visible before its existence. Marcus Rodriguez had been 12 years old when Emma and Lucas Chen disappeared, old enough to remember the search efforts that had consumed Cedar Falls for weeks after September 15, 2001. Now 28 and working as a videographer for a Des Moines marketing firm, Marcus had returned to his hometown in early 2017 to document the changes that had transformed Cedar Falls over the past decade for a local history project. Marcus was particularly interested in how Millbrook Park had evolved since the tragedy that had made it briefly famous. The park had been renovated twice since 2001, with new playground equipment, improved lighting, and the addition of surveillance cameras that might have prevented, or at least documented, the kind of disappearance that had haunted the community for years. He wanted to capture aerial footage that would show the park's current layout compared to how it had looked 16 years earlier. The drone Marcus used for his commercial work was a DJI Mavic Pro, equipped with a high-resolution camera capable of capturing detailed footage from altitudes up to 400 feet. It was the kind of device that would have seemed like science fiction in 2001, but by 2017 had become standard equipment for anyone involved in professional photography or videography. On March 15, 2017, 16.5 years after Emma and Lucas Chen had disappeared, Marcus spent a crisp spring morning flying his drone over Millbrook Park, capturing footage of the renovated playground, the memorial garden, and the wooded areas that had been searched countless times in the months and years following the children's disappearance. The footage he captured was routine at first, sweeping shots of the park's main features, close-ups of the new memorial plaque, aerial views that showed how the park connected to the surrounding residential neighborhoods. Marcus had flown similar missions dozens of times for various projects, and he expected this documentation to be straightforward and unremarkable. But as he guided the drone over the eastern section of the park, the area where the K9 unit had lost Emma and Lucas's scent trail in 2001, something in the live video feed caught his attention. Among the dense cluster of shrubs and native prairie grass that the Park Service had planted as part of their natural habitat restoration project, the drone's camera revealed an irregularity that wasn't visible from ground level. The vegetation in one small area appeared different from its surroundings. Not dramatically different, the discrepancy was subtle enough that it would be invisible to someone walking through the area, but distinct enough to be noticeable from the aerial perspective that the drone provided. The plants grew in a slightly different pattern, with a geometric regularity that seemed inconsistent with natural growth. Marcus initially assumed he was seeing the remains of some old park infrastructure, perhaps a forgotten foundation or buried utility line that was affecting how the vegetation grew above it. But something about the size and shape of the irregular area nagged at him as he reviewed the footage later that evening. The area measured roughly 8 feet by 4 feet, rectangular in shape, oriented along a northeast-southwest axis. The vegetation growing above it appeared younger than the surrounding plants, as if something had been planted or replanted there more recently than the original habitat restoration project. Marcus had covered enough crime stories during his journalism studies to understand that rectangular patterns in vegetation often indicated human activity. He had also lived in Cedar Falls long enough to remember exactly where this area was in relation to where Emma and Lucas Chen had last been seen alive. The decision to contact law enforcement wasn't one Marcus made lightly. He understood that families of missing children received false leads and potential sightings regularly, and he didn't want to cause Sarah and David Chen unnecessary pain if his discovery proved to be nothing more than an old septic system or forgotten utility installation. But he also understood that new technology sometimes revealed information that hadn't been accessible when investigations were originally conducted. Detective Sarah Kim received Marcus's call on March 16, 2017. She had been the lead investigator on the Chen case for 8 years, inheriting it from Detective Morrison when he retired, and she had reviewed every piece of evidence multiple times. The case files contained aerial photographs of Millbrook Park, taken during the original investigation, but those had been captured from helicopters at much higher altitudes and with significantly lower resolution than what Marcus's drone had achieved. Detective Kim met Marcus at Millbrook Park on the morning of March 17th to view the area in question from ground level. Standing among the dense shrubs and native grasses, the geometric pattern that had been visible from the air was completely undetectable. The vegetation looked natural and undisturbed, consistent with a habitat restoration project that had been completed more than a decade earlier. But Detective Kim had been investigating crimes long enough to understand that ground-level appearances could be deceiving, especially in areas where vegetation had been growing for years. She contacted the Cedar Falls Parks Department to request records about the original habitat restoration project, looking for information about what might have been buried or planted in that specific location. The Parks Department records revealed that the Native Prairie Restoration Project had been completed in 2003, 2 years after Emma and Lucas disappeared. The project had involved removing non-native vegetation, preparing soil, and planting indigenous grasses and shrubs throughout the eastern section of the park. The records showed that the specific area Marcus had identified had been part of the restoration project, but they didn't indicate why the vegetation might have grown in the pattern that was visible from aerial perspective. Detective Kim faced a difficult decision. Excavating the area would require significant resources and would likely attract media attention that could prove devastating to Sarah and David Chen if the investigation revealed nothing relevant to their children's disappearance. But failing to investigate a potential lead would be equally problematic, especially if the distinctive vegetation pattern indicated that something had been buried there during the time period when Emma and Lucas had vanished. She decided to request a consultation with forensic anthropologists from the University of Iowa, specialists who could assess whether the vegetation pattern warranted further investigation. The anthropologists visited Millbrook Park on March 20th, using ground-penetrating radar to scan the area that Marcus's drone had identified. The radar results were ambiguous, but suggestive. The scans revealed what appeared to be a rectangular disturbance in the soil layers beneath the vegetation, consistent with an area that had been excavated and refilled at some point since the park's original construction. The disturbance was roughly the same size and shape as the vegetation pattern that had been visible from the air. Dr. Patricia Lawson, the forensic anthropologist who interpreted the radar results, explained to Detective Kim that the scans couldn't determine what, if anything, might be buried in the disturbed soil. The rectangular pattern could indicate human activity as innocent as a forgotten utility repair or as significant as a deliberately concealed burial site. "What I can tell you, Doctor," Lawson said, "is that something happened in this location that involved significant excavation and backfilling. The soil layers show clear evidence of disturbance that occurred after the park's original construction, but before the vegetation was fully established. Given the timeline of when the children disappeared and when the habitat restoration project was completed, it's certainly possible that this disturbance is related to your case." Detective Kim knew that she needed to inform Sarah and David Chen about the discovery before proceeding with any excavation. The conversation was one of the most difficult she'd had to have during her career in law enforcement. After 16 years of false leads and dashed hopes, she needed to explain that new technology had revealed something that might be significant without raising expectations that couldn't be fulfilled. Sarah and David met Detective Kim at the police station on March 22, 2017. They had received calls like this before, reports of potential evidence, possible sightings, new theories about what might have happened to their children. Each time they prepared themselves for disappointment, while allowing hope to flutter in the spaces between facts and possibilities. "I want to be very clear," Detective Kim told them, "that we don't know what, if anything, this means. But drone footage has revealed something in the park that wasn't visible during our original investigation, and we think it warrants further exploration." She showed them Marcus's aerial footage, pointing out the vegetation pattern that had caught his attention, explaining about the ground-penetrating radar results and the forensic anthropologist's assessment. Sarah and David listened in silence, holding hands across the small conference table, their faces showing the careful emotional control they had developed over years of navigating hope and disappointment. "When will you excavate?" Sarah asked finally. "If we excavate," Detective Kim replied. "We're still evaluating whether the evidence justifies that step. Excavation would be expensive, time-consuming, and would attract significant media attention. If we find nothing relevant to Emma and Lucas, it would be another difficult disappointment for your family. But if there's any possibility that this could provide answers about what happened to your children, we need to investigate it thoroughly." David had been studying the aerial footage while Detective Kim spoke. "This area," he said, pointing to the screen, "this is where the dogs lost their scent trail in 2001. This is exactly where Duke stopped tracking and started acting confused." Detective Kim nodded. She had reviewed those reports multiple times, and the location was indeed consistent with where the K9 unit had lost Emma and Lucas's trail 16 years earlier. The significance of this correlation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The decision to proceed with limited excavation was made after consultation with the FBI, the county prosecutor's office, and the families of Emma and Lucas Chen. The excavation would be conducted by forensic specialists using archaeological techniques that would preserve any evidence that might be discovered while minimizing disturbance to the surrounding area. The work was scheduled to begin on April 3, 2017, exactly 16 years, 6 months and 19 days after Emma and Lucas Chen had disappeared from Millbrook Park during what had seemed like the perfect family picnic on a beautiful September afternoon. The excavation of the site in Millbrook Park began at dawn on April 3, 2017, with the kind of methodical precision that forensic archaeology demands. Dr. Patricia Lawson supervised a team of graduate students and law enforcement specialists who approached the rectangular area that Marcus Rodriguez's drone had identified, with the careful reverence appropriate for what might be a crime scene that had remained undisturbed for 16 years. Sarah and David Chen were not present for the excavation itself. Detective Kim had advised them that the process would be slow and potentially traumatic, involving hours of careful soil removal and evidence documentation that could prove emotionally devastating if they witnessed it firsthand. Instead, they waited at home, surrounded by family members and friends who had gathered to provide support during what might be the most significant day in their 16-year search for answers. The excavation site had been cordoned off with police tape and privacy screens to prevent media coverage and protect the integrity of any evidence that might be discovered. Only essential personnel were allowed in the immediate area. Dr. Lawson and her team, Detective Kim, FBI Agent Martinez, who had taken over the case from Agent Cruz, the county coroner, and a photographer who documented every stage of the process. The first layer of soil revealed exactly what the ground-penetrating radar had suggested: clear evidence that the area had been excavated and refilled at some point after the park's original construction. The soil layers showed distinct stratification that indicated human disturbance, with newer soil mixed among older earth in patterns that were inconsistent with natural settling or wildlife activity. Dr. Lawson worked with the systematic patience that her profession required, removing soil in small increments and screening every handful for potential evidence. Her students mapped and photographed each stage of the excavation, creating a detailed record of exactly what was found and where it was discovered within the disturbed area. 3 hours into the excavation, at approximately 10:30 a.m., one of the graduate students made the first significant discovery. Working in the northeastern corner of the excavation site, she uncovered a small piece of fabric that appeared to be synthetic material in a pink color that had faded but remained clearly visible against the dark soil. Dr. Lawson immediately halted the excavation and called Detective Kim over to examine the fabric. The piece was roughly 2 inches square, torn along one edge as if it had been ripped from a larger garment. The color and material were consistent with children's clothing from the early 2000s, though not specific enough to definitively link it to Emma and Lucas Chen. The fabric was carefully removed, documented, and preserved for laboratory analysis. The excavation continued with even greater care, each handful of soil now carrying the possibility that it might contain evidence that could finally answer questions that had haunted a family and community for 16 years. 30 minutes later, Dr. Lawson herself made the discovery that would change everything. Working in the center of the excavation site, approximately 18 inches below the surface, she encountered something that made her pause and call immediately for Detective Kim and Agent Martinez. Partially buried in the disturbed soil, she had found a book. The book was a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, its pages water-damaged and discolored by years underground, but still recognizably the story that had been Emma Chen's favorite. The cover, though faded and partially deteriorated, showed the familiar illustration of Charlotte the Spider and Wilbur the Pig that had graced Emma's personal copy of the book she carried everywhere. Detective Kim felt her heart rate accelerate as she examined the book. Emma Chen had been carrying a copy of Charlotte's Web when she disappeared from Millbrook Park on September 15, 2001. The book had never been found during the extensive searches that followed, and its absence had been one of the details that convinced investigators that the children had been taken rather than having wandered off on their own. But finding the book raised as many questions as it answered. How had Emma's favorite book ended up buried in this specific location? Had she dropped it here, or had someone else buried it deliberately? And if the book was here, where were Emma and Lucas themselves? The excavation continued with renewed intensity. Every grain of soil was now screened and examined for additional evidence. Dr. Lawson expanded the excavation area slightly, following protocols for ensuring that no potential evidence was overlooked. Over the next 2 hours, the team made additional discoveries that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. They found fragments of children's clothing, pieces of denim that could have come from jeans or shorts, fragments of cotton fabric in colors consistent with the clothing Emma and Lucas had been wearing when they disappeared. They found a small plastic dinosaur figurine, the kind that Lucas had collected and carried in his pockets everywhere he went. Each discovery was carefully documented, photographed, and preserved for laboratory analysis. But even without DNA testing or detailed forensic examination, the accumulation of evidence was beginning to tell a story that Detective Kim and Agent Martinez both understood but neither wanted to articulate aloud. At 2:15 p.m., Dr. Lawson made the discovery that confirmed their worst fears. Working in the southwestern corner of the excavation site, she encountered bone fragments that were clearly human and consistent with the remains of children. The excavation was immediately halted. The county coroner was called to the scene, and the area was treated as an active crime scene rather than an archaeological dig. Additional law enforcement personnel arrived to secure the perimeter and begin processing evidence according to criminal investigation protocols. Dr. Lawson and the coroner worked together to carefully expose and document the bone fragments without disturbing their position or destroying potential evidence. What they found painted a heartbreaking picture. The partial skeletal remains of 2 children, buried together in a rectangular grave that had been concealed beneath the Native Prairie Restoration Project, completed in 2003. The bones showed evidence of deliberate burial rather than accidental death or natural decomposition. The remains were positioned with care, lying side by side in a way that suggested whoever had buried them had taken time to arrange them with something approaching respect or tenderness. With the bones, the investigators found more personal items, a small bracelet that Sarah would later identify as one Emma had received for her 8th birthday, shoelaces from sneakers that lit up when the wearer walked. Detective Kim faced the most difficult task of her career, calling Sarah and David Chen to inform them that their 16-year search for answers was over, and that the answers were not what anyone had hoped they would be. The phone call was made at 4:30 p.m. on April 3, 2017. Detective Kim asked Sarah and David to come to the police station immediately, bringing family members for support. She couldn't provide details over the phone, but her tone conveyed the gravity of what had been discovered. Sarah and David drove to the police station in silence, both understanding that after 16 years of hoping their children might be found alive, they were about to learn something that would change their lives forever. They had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality was different from anything they had prepared themselves for. Detective Kim met them in the same conference room where they had discussed Marcus Rodriguez's drone footage 3 weeks earlier. This time she was accompanied by Agent Martinez, a victim services coordinator, and a grief counselor who specialized in working with families of homicide victims. "We found them," Detective Kim said simply. "We found Emma and Lucas." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, a sensation like the earth moving beneath her feet. David reached for her hand, and they held each other as Detective Kim explained what the excavation had revealed. The children had been murdered, probably within hours of their disappearance from the park. They had been buried together in a carefully dug grave that was subsequently concealed when the park's habitat restoration project was completed in 2003. The person responsible had taken advantage of the construction and landscaping work to ensure that the burial site would be disguised and protected from discovery. The investigation was now a homicide case, and law enforcement agencies at local, state, and federal levels would be working to identify who had taken Emma and Lucas from the playground that September afternoon and killed them before burying them in the very park where they had been playing moments before. Sarah and David listened to the details with the strange numbness that shock produces. After 16 years of not knowing, they now knew too much. Their children were dead and had been dead since 2001. Someone had murdered them and hidden their bodies with sufficient care and planning to conceal the crime for a decade and a half. But even in the midst of devastating grief, there was something that felt like relief. The wondering was over. The not knowing, which had been its own form of torture, had ended. Emma and Lucas were home, in a sense. They could finally be laid to rest, and their parents could finally begin to grieve them properly. The killer was still unknown, still free, but that was a different kind of uncertainty than the one Sarah and David had been living with. It was the uncertainty of an active investigation rather than the uncertainty of complete mystery. After 16 years, 6 months, and 19 days, Emma and Lucas Chen had been found. The search was over, but the quest for justice was just beginning. The forensic analysis of the remains found in Millbrook Park took 6 weeks to complete, 6 weeks during which Sarah and David Chen experienced a different kind of waiting than they had known for the previous 16 years. This time, they were waiting for scientific confirmation of what they already knew to be true, waiting for details that would help law enforcement identify who had murdered their children, waiting for permission to finally lay Emma and Lucas to rest. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic anthropologist who analyzed the remains, confirmed what the initial examination had suggested. The bones belonged to 2 children, ages consistent with 8 and 6 years old, who had died approximately 16 years earlier. DNA analysis definitively identified the remains as those of Emma and Lucas Chen. The children had suffered blunt force trauma to their skulls, injuries that would have caused death quickly, but not immediately. The pattern of injuries suggested that the children had been struck with a heavy object, possibly a rock or piece of concrete, in what appeared to be an impulsive rather than premeditated attack. Dr. Walsh's analysis indicated that both children had been killed in the same location, probably within the park itself, and their bodies had been moved to the burial site shortly after death. The killer had taken considerable care with the burial, digging a grave that was deeper and more carefully constructed than would be necessary for concealment alone. The children had been buried side by side, still wearing the clothes they had died in, with Emma's book and Lucas's dinosaur toy placed with their bodies, in what seemed like a gesture of respect or remorse. Detective Kim coordinated the investigation with multiple law enforcement agencies, focusing on individuals who might have had the opportunity to commit the murders, bury the bodies, and take advantage of the habitat restoration project to conceal the grave. The timeline was crucial. The children had disappeared in September 2001, and the Prairie Restoration Project had begun in early 2002, providing a narrow window during which the burial could have been completed and subsequently concealed. The investigation revealed that the Habitat Restoration Project had been carried out by a combination of city employees, volunteer organizations, and contracted landscaping companies. More than 40 people had worked on various aspects of the project, and all of them became potential suspects who needed to be interviewed and investigated. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rodriguez, the videographer whose drone footage had led to the discovery of the grave, continued documenting Millbrook Park for his local history project. While reviewing archival footage from the original park renovation in 2002-2003, he discovered something that investigators had missed during their initial review of the project records. In several clips of the restoration work, Marcus noticed a City Parks employee who appeared to be working alone in the specific area where Emma and Lucas had been buried. The employee was identifiable from his uniform and city vehicle, and cross-referencing with employment records revealed his identity: Robert Milliken, a maintenance worker who had been employed by the Cedar Falls Parks Department from 1998 to 2004. Milliken's employment file contained information that immediately caught Detective Kim's attention. He had been placed on administrative leave in late 2001 for behavioral issues that were never fully documented, and he had resigned from his position in early 2004, citing personal reasons. More significantly, his supervisor's notes indicated that Milliken had shown inappropriate interest in families using the park and had been counseled about watching children play rather than focusing on his assigned duties. Detective Kim attempted to locate Milliken for questioning, but discovered that he had died in 2009 from complications related to alcoholism. He had spent his final years living alone in a trailer park outside of Waterloo, approximately an hour's drive from Cedar Falls. According to neighbors and former co-workers, Milliken had become increasingly reclusive and had struggled with alcohol and mental health issues following his resignation from the Parks Department. The investigation team obtained a search warrant for Milliken's former residence, though the trailer had been sold and its contents disposed of years earlier. However, interviews with his former neighbors revealed disturbing information about his behavior during the years following his resignation from the Parks Department. Several neighbors reported that Milliken had talked obsessively about children who didn't belong in the park, claiming that some families didn't deserve to use public spaces and that he had taken care of problems during his time as a city employee. They had dismissed these comments as the ramblings of a disturbed alcoholic, but in the context of the investigation, they took on a more sinister significance. A former co-worker at the Parks Department, interviewed by Detective Kim, recalled that Milliken had made racist comments about families using Millbrook Park and had specifically mentioned the Chen family as not belonging in a place like that. The co-worker had reported these comments to supervisors, leading to Milliken's administrative leave in late 2001. The timeline aligned perfectly with Emma and Lucas's disappearance. Milliken had been placed on leave in November 2001, 2 months after the children vanished, but he had continued to have access to Parks Department equipment and knowledge of ongoing projects, including the habitat restoration work that would provide cover for concealing their grave. Additional evidence emerged from the forensic analysis of the burial site. Soil samples from the grave contained traces of herbicide that was specific to the type used by the Parks Department in 2001. Tool marks on the disturbed earth were consistent with equipment that would have been available to Parks Department employees. Most significantly, DNA analysis of evidence found with the children's remains included genetic material that matched samples obtained from items in Milliken's former residence. While Milliken's death meant that he would never face trial for the murders of Emma and Lucas Chen, law enforcement officials concluded that there was sufficient evidence to definitively identify him as their killer. Detective Kim presented the case findings to Sarah and David Chen on May 18, 2017, explaining how their children had died and why their bodies had remained hidden for 16 years. The knowledge was both devastating and liberating. Sarah and David finally had answers to questions that had consumed their lives for more than a decade and a half. Emma and Lucas had been killed by a disturbed individual who had targeted them because of his racist beliefs and his twisted sense of ownership over public spaces. Their deaths had been senseless and brutal, but they had not suffered long, and they had not been alone. The children were laid to rest on June 10, 2017, at Elmwood Cemetery in Cedar Falls, not far from the park where they had spent their last afternoon playing together. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family members, friends, community members, who had never forgotten the children who had vanished 16 years earlier, and law enforcement officers who had worked on the case over the years. Sarah spoke at the service, her voice steady despite the tears that flowed freely down her cheeks. "Emma and Lucas have been missing from our daily lives for 16 years, she said, but they have never been missing from our hearts. They have been waiting patiently for us to bring them home, and now we finally can." David planted a tree in Millbrook Park near the Memorial Garden, a young oak that would grow and provide shade for future families who came to the park for picnics and playground adventures. The tree was dedicated to the memory of Emma and Lucas Chen and to all children who deserve to play safely in public spaces without fear or hatred. The investigation into their murders was officially closed, but the impact of their story continued to resonate throughout Cedar Falls and beyond. Changes were implemented in how city employees were screened and supervised when working around children. The park's surveillance system was upgraded, and new protocols were established for monitoring individuals who showed inappropriate interest in families using public recreation facilities. Marcus Rodriguez completed his documentary about Millbrook Park, dedicating it to Emma and Lucas Chen and to the importance of community vigilance in protecting children. The film premiered at the Cedar Falls Community Center in September 2017, exactly 16 years after the children's disappearance, and was subsequently distributed to law enforcement agencies as a training tool for missing children investigations. Sarah and David slowly began the process of building a life that included their grief, but wasn't defined entirely by it. They established a foundation in Emma and Lucas's memory that provided support services for families of missing children and funded improvements to playground safety and community awareness programs. The house that had waited for 16 years for their children to come home was finally transformed from a shrine to interrupted childhood into a place where memories could be honored without being preserved in frozen time. Emma's room became a library where Sarah tutored students who struggled with reading, sharing her daughter's love of books with children who needed encouragement and support. Lucas's room became an office where David worked on park safety consultations, using his engineering expertise to help communities create safer spaces for children to play. The red checkered tablecloth, which had remained folded in a closet drawer for 16 years, was finally used again for a family picnic in Millbrook Park on a warm Saturday afternoon in September 2018. Sarah and David spread it on the same table, where they had waited for Emma and Lucas to come running across the grass for lunch, and they ate sandwiches and remembered their children not as victims of a terrible crime, but as the joyful, curious, loving individuals they had been during their short lives. If stories like Sarah's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.